So this is intended to be a real quick overview for some of the technical bits within the island project, really kind of focusing on reviewing mechanics, kind of getting up and running from the ground up with Playmaker, and really just kind of honing in on some of the core mechanics that we're going to scale up over time. So first thing here is I'm here on my island. Just got kind of bare bones island environment. I need to install Playmaker, so I'm going to jump out onto the asset store and make sure I'm logged in. I'm going to go to my download bin. Because I have not used Playmaker in this project, I'm going to need to do that. So I'm just going to search for it by title, or I'll type in the title of it, and here it is. So it does say to update, so it looks like the current version of Playmaker that I had downloaded needs to be updated. And I'll just import this into my current game. Now, the import process, we're going to import it one time, and then when we do, we still have to go through the install process. So I need to install Playmaker, and this is a little misleading. This little pop-up jumps up, and hiding behind it is the install button. So I'm going to close this little pre-scan. I'll hit the install button. I'll say go ahead and install. I made a backup. So make sure that you do that. And once you install, you have to import again. So basically it unpackages all of the assets, and I'll hit import. If you're opening up a project on a new machine, moving back and forth, maybe a different version of Unity or Playmaker, if you open it up in a newer version of Unity, you might get stuck. But if you're getting errors, console errors in Playmaker, opening on another machine, what you can do is you can remove any reference to Playmaker in your assets folder and just reinstall it. And there's a couple of assets. There's the editor. Let's see, okay. There's the editor. There's the Playmaker folder. And then you'll get a little warning down here if you're still getting any kind of a conflict. So again, if you're opening up an older project, you might need to clean it up a little bit. But anyway, I'm going to jump back into my scene. So just a couple of quick notes in this scene. I am using the rigid body first-person controller. You can find that in standard assets, inside characters, first-person controller, prefabs, and I'm using the rigid body version of this. There's the first-person controller, which is going to use a character controller model. This is the rigid body model. It'll help simplify some of the mechanics that we develop. So I've dragged that into my scene. You can see it here. If you don't have access to this in your standard assets, you just need to import it. You can do that when you establish your project. If you're missing it, just go to Assets, Import Package, and choose Characters. Import the package, and then you'll end up inside your standard assets folder. You'll have a character folder, and then you can dig down and find that prefab. In addition to that, you can always search for assets. There's a search field here in the project folder. And in this case, if I just type in FPS, it'll go find anything that references FPS in the title. So I'm going to go back out to my assets folder. So the first thing I'm going to set up is I'm going to establish Playmaker inside my view. So I'm going to maximize my viewport here so I can take advantage of some of the screen real estate I have. I'm going to open up the Playmaker editor. I'm going to close this little splash screen that keeps popping up. There's some valuable information in there, but that's for another time. So I'm going to grab the Playmaker tab and just nest it right to the right so I can see my project folder and Playmaker. I'm also going to grab the Playmaker editor window. Editor windows, I'm going to open up the action browser. There's some other interesting browsers in there that we'll get to later, but I'm going to nest the action browser off to the right side so that I can see the inspector and my actions browser. I can open and close the action browser pretty quickly through the Playmaker editor window, but I like having it open because it'll help me familiarize myself with what some of the options are here. So I have a first-person controller. If I hit the play button, I'm just going to test my environment. It's a pretty simple, standard environment. Just spent a little bit of time kind of sculpting a little variation in the landscape and adding some textures, spending a few more minutes than I would have during a demo in class, but still just kind of a rough mock-up. The first thing I want to do is establish a pickup cube. The pickup cube will provide that foundation for pretty much any kind of mechanic where we're going to pick something up. And so in order to do this, I'm going to start off with a cube. I like to wireframe things with cubes. And I don't see my cube, and it's always helpful to make sure that we're on the move tool. That'll give us the axes inside of our scene. Now, seems like it's kind of far away from where my rigid body, my player is, where I'm spawning. So I want to make sure I take that cube and move it closer to where I'm spawning, so I don't have to run and hunt for this. And there's a couple different ways that we can do this. One of the easiest things to do is to go to Game Object. So I have my cube selected, and I'll go to Game Object, and we can move to View. In this case, that just kind of centered this thing inside my view. Looks like it's still stuck inside the ground. And so what I'm going to do, that didn't work the way that I intended it to do. And if I reframe my view, so in other words, I'll focus on my first-person controller, and I'll try that again. I'll select my cube, and I'll say Game Object. I'll move to View, and that'll snap the cube to the center of the wherever the camera is. So I was kind of at a funny angle, and it moved that cube. So this is really essentially occupying the same space as the first-person controller right now. And that's because I was just double-clicked on the first-person controller, or I framed that object inside my view. You can do the same thing by selecting an object and choosing Command F. We'll frame that object. So I'm just going to align that to view. I'm going to move this cube over and kind of put it in front of my first-person controller, far enough away to where I won't spawn on it, but close enough to where I don't have to run across my island to interact with it. Now, I'm going to slow it down a little bit here and utilize some materials so that I have a little bit more contrast here. So I already have a materials folder established, and I'm going to create a new material, and just so it's a little bit less of a wireframe. And this material, I'll call this my pickup, just kind of a general pickup for now. I can change the name later, I can change the color later. It's just kind of a neutral pickup. So I'll select that material I just created, and I'll go to the inspector, and I'm interested in the albedo color channel here, and I'll click on this little white swatch, and that'll bring up this RGB slider. And I'll just kind of choose a color that I think is appropriate for my pickup cube. So kind of just this kind of blue-gray for now. Once I establish this color, I could build swatches. Just want to point out that in this color picker, once I establish a color, I could create a new color swatch, and now I have a preset here, so that can be kind of a useful thing. And I'm going to take this material and drag and drop it onto my cube. I want to get in the habit of renaming my cubes as we go, even if they're temporary. I'm just including some keywords. That way, when my scene gets complex, I can search for certain kinds of objects here in the search field. So here's my pickup cube. I want to build the real simple mechanic that allows me to run into this cube and ultimately pick it up or destroy it, kind of giving that visual cue that we've picked up the cube. So right now I just have a standard cube with a material inside the environment. When I walk up to it, I'll bump into it. Can't really do much with it. But I am colliding with this object. I'm running into the box collider component of this cube. If I look at my first-person controller, you see here in the preview I have this little green wire, this capsule wire. That's the collider of the first-person controller that I have here. So this collider is bumping into that collider. What we want to do, I'm going to go select my cube, is we want to build a simple mechanic in Playmaker that allows us to detect if we're running into this thing. So I'm going to right-click to add an FSM, and now that we got our bearings with Playmaker, it's important that we start naming our state machines. And we name our state machines there's a couple of different ways. But when we add an FSM, or finite state machine, to this object, we get a state machine component here attached to the object, and we can rename the state machine over here where it says FSM. And I like to keep the FSM, and I'll say pickup. And that way, if I add an additional state machine to it, we'll see two of them here providing two different functions. Alternatively, I can go to the FSM tab, and you can see here now that it inherited the name that I used. I could change this name, pick up, just use an exclamation point, which is probably not a best practice, but you can see it updates the name here. And this will be important later when we start referencing state machines. And there's some basic control for the state machine, but I'm going to let everything default. On state 1, I generally like to use this convention of an idle state. So this machine is lying in wait, or this mechanic is just kind of sitting waiting for input from the game engine or from the user. So we're just going to sit here and idle. Okay. I want a second state, which I'll add a second state. In this state, if we ever get to this state, this is where the object gets picked up. Okay. So I'm going to go back and select the idle state, and I want to build the action, which will provide the input for the game, letting us know that we bumped into this thing. And I can do that by using a physics action. I'll go into the physics category, and I'm looking for collision event. To add this collision event, I want to make sure that I have the state, my target state selected, and I could click and drag and drop it into the state tab, or just double click to add that. In addition, I'll just remove this action. I could select it and hit return, and that adds it to the current state that I have selected here in Playmaker. So effectively, when we run this game, this pickup cube has its own logic attached to it. It starts and it passes it to the idle state. We're going to sit in the idle state until we have some kind of an event that becomes true that passes from one state to another based on any kind of conditions that we set here. In this case, we're listening for a collision event. We're listening for an on-collision enter with an untagged object. So we talked about tags in class, and I just want to select my rigid body first-person controller. Note that my tag is currently set to untagged, and that's good. I'm going to leave that there for now, but later we'll filter based on different kinds of tags. So we're detecting a collision with an object that is set to untagged, and that's good. The next thing is I need to establish a send event. So in other words, when it detects this collision, I want to be able to fire off an event. The event are kind of the road signs or the direction to which we should exit a state. And so we need an event here, and probably the easiest way to build an event, you could either go to the event tab and manually create your event, which is my preference, but you could also choose this send event drop-down menu and see if you have any events listed under none. It's some custom events. We want to avoid system and network events for now. I don't have anything other than system and network events, so I'm going to choose to create a new event. This event is just a title. It's a keyword, something that we're creating. And I'm going to kind of use a long form name here, and I'm going to say object has been hit. And so I've created an event. Now when I have an event, if I go to the event tab, you can see that the event is listed here, and we can have multiple events depending on how many we need per state machine. I'm going to go back to my state view, and now Playmaker does a pretty good job of letting us know that there's an error, and it does a pretty good job of correcting errors for us, but I want to resist the urge to let Playmaker tell us what to do, and I want us to kind of solve the, squash the bug that's been presented. So right now we're listening for a collision event. When that event occurs, it's going to pass it to an event called object has been hit. Well, the error that we're getting is that we don't have that event added to this state yet. So I'm going to right click and add the transition event. You can see here's the object has been hit. And you can think of this kind of like a road sign. So we've added one of these road signs. It's attached to an action, at least in this case, this action. If it's true, it'll pass it, tell it to fire off this send event. So at this point, we can point the object has been picked up. We can point this any direction we want. And in this case, it's a really simple mechanic, simple logic. So it's just a two-state solution here. We're either in an idle state, listening to be hit, and if we get hit by an untagged object, it's going to send it along this send event. In this case, this object has been hit. We can find that object has been hit and pass it over here to this picked up state. There are no actions on the picked up state at this point, but this is testable logic. And so I'll hit the play button. With the cube selected, I can preview the Playmaker logic here. And when I bump into this cube, I can see that it fires and sends it to the picked up state. So I know that this basic mechanic, this basic logic is working, and this is going to be kind of the core concept for any kind of pickup that we use. Once we pass it to this picked up state, we can do anything that we want with it. In this case, I'm simply just going to destroy the game object. So I'm going to go to the game object action category here, and I'm looking for destroy self. I could destroy some other things, destroy a game object and point to itself, but destroy self is probably the most efficient way to do this. So I'll select destroy self, I'll hit return, noting that I had the picked up state already selected. And so the basic logic goes something like this. When we play our game, we go from the start state and pass it to the idle state. This cube is going to run any logic that's on this state. And in this case, it's a collision event that it's waiting or testing for. When it detects that it collides with an untagged object, it'll pass it to the object has been hit. And in this case, we've wired that transition event to a second state that will cause the owner of this object to be destroyed. So this pickup cube will disappear from the hierarchy when we run into this cube. So here we go. I ran into the cube. I can look in my hierarchy over on the left side and see that the cube is no longer there. So that's kind of the core concept for the pickup object. In the next presentation, we'll wire this over to a health system. We'll start to build out the health system and talk about the core concepts of that, and I'll give you an overview of that workflow to establish the health system. But we'll do that in the next presentation.